hopefully some more will join us as well.
Okay.
All right, I think we can begin. So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned to some of you initially, unfortunately, there's been a slight change in our program because Krista Salamandra is under the weather and won't be able to join us, but we're very fortunate to have Noor Halabi, who will be stepping in and discussing Syria in her place. And we're having this panel in advance of our upcoming issue on media and peace, which I just mentioned will be coming out next month. So why are we publishing an issue on media and peace, and why are we having this panel? Well, frankly, we're a little bit sick of all the doom and gloom that we've all been subjected to over the last couple of years, but also because there have been some really important steps towards regional stability and peace processes happening in the region, even if some of them are indeed opportunistic. And some of these include, of course, the normalization agreement between Israel and some of the Arab states, as well as the cooling of tensions between Qatar and regional adversaries, which I believe Philip Sieb will be touching on today as well. And even yesterday, if we're talking regionally, in the Middle East more broadly, you know, even the UAE National Security Advisor met his Iranian counterpart yesterday.
Yes.
So beyond, you know, the importance of understanding sort of the geopolitical dynamics of these movements, it's really important, of course, for us to understand the role of media, whether we're talking about reporting, ICT, the use of social media, and influencing prospects for stability in the region. Now, if we sort of take a broader lens, looking inward at the Arab region, for many years, the region has been synonymous with instability and conflict, particularly in the international press. And it was interesting today when I was sort of prepping for this discussion, I found an old article that was published by Jack Shaheen, the journalist, the well-known journalist and media commentator and professor who sadly passed in 2017. And this is like a little bit from his abstract that was published in this article from 1985. Quote, "A distorted media image of the Arab people is becoming ingrained in American culture and continues to inhibit a resolution of the Middle East conflict. News correspondents' misperceptions of Arabs permeate their reports. Policymakers' crucial decisions may be influenced by those unrealistic perceptions, and the public's stereotypical images may affect the formation and acceptance of policy. Pertinent to the image problem are illustrations of how misperceptions from the past have helped and continue to help influence policymakers' actions and decisions. Fair portrayals and accurate information are essential to foreign policy decisions. False images and incorrect information may corrupt the policymaking process." And I was sort of taken aback because, you know, this could have been written today. And the only thing that really struck me as being different is the vehicle for the transmission of information. So with this in mind, we're going to be working through some of these themes today in the following way. We'll begin with Philip Sieb, sort of examining the broader importance of information and its transfer and conflict. And then we're going to sort of bring it down to more specifics in a number of regional contexts. So this is going to include the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Qatar, Libya, Syria, and we'll close with the role of women in a variety of these contexts, specifically women's activisms in Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, Tunisia, and Egypt. And with that, I'm just going to give introduce all of our very accomplished panelists. We're very fortunate to have them with us today. First, we have Philip Sieb, who recently retired from the University of Southern California after 40 years of university teaching. At USC, he held professorships in journalism, public diplomacy, and international relations. His academic work focuses on interactions between news, media, and foreign policy, with particular attention to media and war. His many books include The Al Jazeera Effect, How Terrorism Evolves, and his recently published, I believe published earlier this year, Information at War, Journalism, Disinformation, and Modern Warfare. We also have joining us today Sahar Khamis, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and an affiliate professor in the Department of Women's Studies and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is co-author of the books Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, and Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism. More recently, she is the co-editor of the book Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions. In addition to being a prolific researcher and writer, she is a media commentator, analyst, a public speaker, radio host, and a former human rights commissioner. Also joining us is Jalal Harshawi. Jalal's work concentrates on North Africa, covering aspects such as various countries' security landscape and political economy. Jalal is a frequent commentator on Libya in the international press. He has published in Foreign Affairs, Lawfare, Politique étrangère, Foreign Policy, Small Arms Survey, and has previously concentrated on the same topics at the Clingendael Institute at The Hague. And more recently, he's a senior fellow at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and Jalal is based in Paris. And today he's joining us in his capacity as an individual researcher on Libyan affairs. And finally, we have Noor Halabi, who is a lecturer of media and communication at the University of Leeds and the vice chair of the Race Network of the Media Communication and Cultural Studies Association. Her interdisciplinary research examines the interactions between mobility, social movements, and global media and discourse. Recent publications include the book Discourses in Action, for which she was an editor, and her upcoming book, Radical Hospitality, examines the history of United States immigration policy and its media coverage. So just as a note, if you have any questions, you can put them in the text box, sort of as they come to you as the discussion goes on, and we'll have a nice, hopefully nice and long Q&A period at the end of, once the panelists have all finished their presentations. So that's quite enough from me. I'll hand the floor over to Phil now, who will discuss information and Hamas and IDF, as well as the Qatar crisis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's very nice to be back at AUC, although just virtually. It's been many years since I've been there in person. And it's nice to see old friends like Sahar and Hussein, whom I haven't seen in person also for many years, and to meet new friends as well. What I want to talk about today is drawn from my book, Information at War. I want to talk about information as an equalizer, as a means of empowerment. You know, in 2011, during the Arab uprisings, much was said about information tools, especially social media being used to galvanize and organize publics protesting the way in which they were being compelled to live. But what about the content conveyed by these tools, information itself? How much power does it have? In a modern geopolitical context, global public opinion can be easily influenced, often at high speed, but also with great volatility and susceptibility to manipulation. Today, I want to cite two information-based cases in the Middle East, one that illustrates equalizing power and another that is a warning about how information, if misused, can precipitate a crisis. The first case involves Hamas and Israel, and it covers intermittent conflict from 2008 to 2014. During the Gaza War of 2008 and 9, named Operation Cast Lead by the Israeli Defense Forces, the world received decidedly one-sided information about the fighting. Casualty figures vary, but roughly 1,400 Palestinians were killed, while 13 Israelis died, 10 of whom were soldiers, and 4 of these were killed by friendly fire. Israel's military superiority was underscored, but questions about proportionality were obviously raised. What information about the war could the global public receive? Not much. Israel had an information strategy. First, it sealed off the conflict zone, the combat zone, preventing foreign journalists from having access. That the world received information through an Israeli filter. The IDF posted videos on YouTube showing bombing runs that appeared to target only Hamas combatants. The world mostly saw the story as Israel wanted it told. Hamas was totally unprepared to fight an information war, relying on blogs and websites with limited audiences. It lost the war on the ground, and it lost in the court of public opinion. Jumping ahead to 2014, we come to another Israel-Hamas war called by the IDF Operation Protective Edge. Once again, in terms of inflicting casualties, Israel had the upper hand. Approximately 2,200 Palestinians were killed, while 72 Israelis, 67 of whom were soldiers, died. What had changed since 2009 was recognition by Hamas that it needed its own information strategy. And so during the week leading up to the fighting, the Twitter hashtag Gaza under attack was used 375,000 times. And during the month-long war itself, more than 4 million times. This was outdoing the IDF Twitter account more than 20-fold. In this flood of information, what about accuracy? For instance, Hamas posted photos allegedly showing destruction in Palestinian civilian areas. But the BBC found that some of those photos were actually from earlier conflicts in Iraq and Syria. Reflecting on Hamas's upgraded information presence, IDF spokesman Peter Lerner said this, and this is a quote I'm going to take from the book. Which I now can't find. Okay. If you are absent on the social media space, you cede that space to the enemy. You have to be there to lead the conversation, especially in wartime. If you're silent on social media, you're not putting anything in your enemy's way that prevents their message from gaining steam. If you're silent on social media, you're not getting your own message across. And if you're silent on social media, you're not giving your supporters ammunition to use. And again, that comes from a senior spokesperson for the IDF. Israel's overall military superiority is clear. If it wanted to crush Gaza militarily, it could. But particularly now that Hamas and others in Gaza better understand the power of information, what is militarily possible for the IDF might no longer be politically feasible. Of this, journalist David Patrikarakos said, asymmetric warfare is not so asymmetric anymore. The IDF would have to meet Hamas not just on the battlefield, but in cyberspace. War would have to be brought at the narrative level as well as at the physical level. To assess the significance of information's effects on public opinion and public opinion's effects on war making, let's briefly move backward in time to the 8-day conflict in 2012 called by the IDF Operation Pillar of Defense. One academic study found, quote, shifts in public support reduce conflict intensity, particularly for Israel, end quote. The report found that as online support for Hamas increased, Israel significantly reduced its number of airstrikes. Cause and effect in that case is unproven, but the findings suggest that overall military strategy can be affected by the political realities shaped by information and global public opinion. A more recent case illustrates the danger that can be created by false but widely disseminated information. On May 24th, 2017, the website of the official Qatar news agency reported, and I'll read again a quote from this, it reported that that Qatar's Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, had given a speech praising Hamas, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran. Quotes from the speech were then posted on Q&A's social media accounts and on the news ticker at the bottom of the screen of the Q&A YouTube channel. Within minutes, the speech was denounced on Saudi-owned news channel Al Arabiya and on UAE channel Sky News Arabia. These reports accuse Qatar of supporting extremist organizations and destabilizing the region. Qatar claimed that the Q&A accounts had been hacked. The information contest was underway, and it soon moved to Washington, D.C., where lobbyists and public relations professionals used various media venues to continue the information war by making the case for whatever side paid them. We all have our theories about who was involved in precipitating the blockade crisis, but for our purposes today, the lesson here is how the information-driven crisis quickly and dangerously escalated. If there were rumors at the time, of course, that there might be an invasion of Qatar, the United States became involved belatedly, and again, we don't know all the details of this, but its information-driven crises can quickly escalate, and we should be prepared for more such incidents. So what's next? Information will continue to flow more rapidly and more broadly as communication technologies become more accessible. That flow can overwhelm those who are not prepared for it. In light of that, media professionals and educators have a responsibility to better address critical thinking and media literacy. Our rising generations, in particular, need to be prepared for a civic environment in which information is ever more significant. This will be true whether you're in Cairo, Baghdad, Riyadh, or elsewhere in the Arab world, as well as in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. This requires our prompt and thoughtful attention during times of peace, as well as during times of conflict. So that's sort of an overview with a couple of, I think, fairly striking examples of how information in both war and peace is becoming more significant, and not just in the Arab world, but throughout the globe. So I look forward to discussing this and your questions as we move forward. Okay, Sarah.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. I think we'll move now to Jalal, if you'd like to give your presentation on Libya. And Jalal, you've been muted, so if you can just unmute yourself, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm deeply honored.
Sorry,
I'm deeply honored to be associated with the American University of Cairo, which I always admired. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to basically make a presentation organized along two parts. I'm going to begin by giving you a rough picture of where Libya stands today, because there's a lot of this elections talk, and the reality is a little bit different from this hopeful message that is being conveyed by a lot of the international press. And from there, I will be able to just focus on the role of social media, the media writ large, when it comes to how it has been used by different factions, because we all know that Libya has been really a very deeply fractured landscape, and of course the media have been a collateral victim of this, and also a weapon that was part of much of the conflict, especially of the last 3 years, I would say. In terms of the situation itself, if you look at the news, you basically will see that there is a commitment, supposedly, to make sure that with a certain amount of pressure from the international community, and hopefully with the proper commitment on the part of Libyan factions and Libyan institutions, there would be, according to many articles, elections held this month on the 24th of December, 2021, which is a highly symbolic anniversary. It's 70 years ago, it was the day Libya, one of the first decolonized nations, was recognized by the UN. What we keep hearing is that the first round of the presidential elections, the first ones of that nature in the history of Libya, would take place on that day. The reality is that those elections are most probably not going to happen. I'm personally certain they will not be held. But it's also important to realize that a lot of the conflict will probably resume. There's a de facto partition between East and West that not only is it not being remedied, but it's also going to continue going in the wrong direction towards a deeper form of partition. But it hasn't been war. There hasn't been much exchange of fire or much violence since June 2020. So what happened in June 2020, it was the moment when this military commander by the name of Khalifa Haftar, Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, based in the East, he had tried, starting in April 2019, to forcefully enter Tripoli and topple the UN recognized government at the time called the Government of National Accord in the capital. And by hoping for this kind of success, he thought that he was going to basically dominate the entire nation. And he tried violently, not for a couple of days as he planned, but in fact, he lashed out for 14 months. Roughly 3,500 or 4,000 Libyans died violently within that circumstance. And although he had benefited from the help of the Emiratis, so we're talking about a military intervention, 1,000 airstrikes conducted not by Libyans, but by Emirati personnel. Of course, the help of 3,000 Russian mercenaries, a lot of benevolence on the part of Western states like France. What happened effectively was that Turkey intervened starting in early 2020 in a very major way and helping the Libyans on the Tripoli side of things. They were basically able to defeat Haftar in a relatively humiliating way. And starting at that moment, or even a few weeks prior, what happened was this pragmatic dialogue between Turkey and Russia, between Ankara and Moscow. And those two Eurasian powers that have nothing to do with the Arab world, have nothing to do with Africa, and have nothing to do with Western Europe, decided that from a very selfish perspective, to continue war was not really useful from their perspective. And they kind of struck an arrangement that made the balance of power that had been achieved in terms of quantity of interference from the foreign world, from outside on both sides of the main divide, that kind of became static. And the balance of power that kind of emerged in the spring of 2020 kind of has remained ever since. Foreign forces didn't leave the country. You still have 3,000 Russians, 2,000 Syrian mercenaries on the side of Field Marshal Haftar, 4,000 Syrians on the side of Tripoli. All of that foreign interference has never gone away, but it also has made it possible to preserve a form of calm. And that calm, which has nothing to do really with Western diplomacy or the UN, was utilized by the UN to promote the emergence of a unified government, which actually received the blessing of Parliament in March of this year. So all of that happened through a designation process of the UN. So it was not elections by any means. And the argument of the UN when it kind of helped cobble together this government was that, it was just an experiment. It was just a way of showing that one unified government could exist in Tripoli and be recognized across the nation. And if some factions don't like the Turkish-backed prime minister that has been in place since March, Abdelhamid Dbeibeh, then those factions could just basically be patient And in December 2021, you would have this wonderful moment when you would have peaceful elections. And if Dbeibah is really not popular enough, then he would be replaced peacefully by another figure. This is not happening. It's not falling into place. In fact, what has happened has been a politicization of this process by which elections should have been prepared. So the electoral laws are distorted by conflict of interests, manipulation. Of course, there's a large set of factions, especially in the northwest of Libya, that have been opposed to the elections because they want the status quo. And all of that bad faith, if you will, that has existed on both sides has created a very, very weak legal framework, so weak that the elections can't seem to be happening. So this is the situation, and what we are going to probably find out within the next hours and the next days is that this news that I'm sharing with you will be actually officially shared by credible institutions that will admit that nothing is happening this year. The elections will not take place. What will happen at that moment is that some form of a contest, armed contest, will resume. A lot of armed actors that have been patient this year will cease to be patient, and they will try to position themselves and remind their rivals that they have to be reckoned with, that they are relevant because they are powerful, they are able to grab territory. So it will probably see a form of violence return, unfortunately. So what have the media been doing in all of this? What I described over the last few minutes is basically a very intensive, destructive war of Tripoli, going from April 2019 all the way to June 2020. And then since June 2020, it has been a form of decent calm. In reality, the media landscape associated with Libya became much more polarized right before the offensive on Tripoli. A lot of that deterioration of the professional nature of some journalists, the quality of some websites, a lot of the trolls that are active in Facebook and Twitter, all of these things got much more active, much more toxic, and much more aggressive just in the weeks preceding April 2019. And of course, the deterioration continued during the war. Libyans were deeply affected by this media landscape. A lot of people that kind of knew that were speaking with other Libyans on the other side of the fault line stopped talking to people with a slightly different opinion. There were many more personal attacks on social media. And the habit that has become the habit of many, many Libyans who are very active. I mean, they all are very, very much aware of where to look for information on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. Those Libyans basically became locked through loyalty, through a form of obstinacy. They became completely confined in very specific channels that, despite being extremely subjective, became their only source of information. So what I'm describing is not very original, but you have to kind of acknowledge that in Libya, it's particularly spectacular. For example, you would be amazed at the quality of some of the fake news that circulates on a regular basis. It's very sophisticated, it's well done, and very experienced experts fall in the trap still, after, trying to swear that they would never be a victim of this kind of hoax. So the quality and also the means, the financial means behind some of the channels is quite spectacular. This is due to foreign interference. There's a lot of Libya channels that are based in Jordan, that are based in Dubai, and sometimes even in European countries. You have involvement of states like Greece, and you basically end up with these blurred lines between the Western universe and the Arab universe, and of course the Libyan realm. Everybody is guilty of spreading disinformation. So it's not like the Libyans fighting themselves through lies and fabrication, and the Western channels and Western capitals being completely innocent. You have a mutual penetration of some of the fake journalism, downright lies, and so on and so forth. So I really insist that you should not imagine that the Libyans are basically separate from the Western realm. And all of that basically got that bad for the purpose of basically that I would say that the main purpose of what happened on the pro Haftar side was to create doubt and give the impression that what was a physical aggression was not really a physical aggression. What was really destructive in terms of the number of internally displaced people, at some stage the number was reaching the bar of 100,000 innocent civilians in the Tripoli area that basically had to flee their homes. A lot of people never recovered their homes because they were destroyed or sackaged. It wasn't really a violent aggression. It was just an advance. So you have like this promotion of euphemisms, which really helped because, you know, if you're a Libyan and you're not being, let's say, on the receiving end of drone strikes, then if you were living, let's say, 400 kilometers away or 1,000 kilometers away, God knows how big Libya is, then you would be encouraged to think that what Haftar was doing was basically simply some relatively elegant attempt at entering Tripoli, but it wasn't really mayhem, it wasn't really violent, it wasn't really an attack. And of course, on the international stage, this was even more useful because the EU never condemned the move, the US never condemned the move, and of course the UN was completely paralyzed. And these media channels I'm referring to really played a role. So okay, so and of course on the other side, I mean, the other side is not made of angels. I mean, the one supported by Turkey and Qatar also utilized a lot of fiction, a lot of sophisticated disinformation to show that the other side was particularly deep, you know, it was basically the devil. It was made of only gangsters, they were drugged, and there were abuses. The number of killings was even higher than the actual figure, and so on and so forth. So both sides used disinformation in a rather aggressive way. But the one that started was, of course, the side that was physically conducting the offensive. So all of that had a usefulness within the context of the war against Tripoli. But when the war stopped, the media landscape didn't get better. It never got back to what it used to be before the attack. It remained very toxic. It remained very fractured, with people just looking for information always in the same place. And even if they experience multiple instances where a particular channel they're loyal to has lied to them, they will continue going there and not go back to maybe a little bit more moderate channels, or sometimes even try what the adversary, quote unquote, is saying. No, everybody has remained in their silos. So this is really striking because the international, and Sarah said that during the introduction, the international dimension of what is happening in the region is much less polarized. People are talking to each other. Mohammed bin Zayed visited Ankara, and then Tahnoun went to Iran, and of course Sisi was speaking with Tamim, but Libya has remained basically trapped in the very polarized media landscape that was created for a very specific purpose that is now a thing of the past. And there has been no real improvement, at least not commensurate with the improvement that happened in the physical world. So I think this will kind of give you a rough picture of the Libya situation. In terms of extremism, maybe a few comments very, very briefly. Daesh is very, very weak. It's not gone. It still exists. You have probably something like 200 Daesh fighters moving around and sometimes raising hell. There has been 3 major terror attacks in the southwestern part of Libya, the Fezzan. It's part of the Sahara, the Libyan Sahara, this year alone. So it's just somewhere between 100 and 200 fighters in their convoy. It's not a lot. It's sometimes enough to create very, very dangerous incidents, but it's not a major concern. There hasn't been any strikes on the part of the Americans, and people are basically comfortable that the situation is not getting out of hands. If the elections were to happen, we would probably see some form of a Daesh comeback in cities, because in cities you do have, in all likelihood, you have hundreds of dormant cells, sleeping cells, that would probably kick back into action if you have this symbol of Western-style liberal democracy manifesting itself in Tripoli or Misrata or even Benghazi. Then those people would probably wake up and put a bomb at a polling station. Most typically, something similar happened in April 2018. But with the elections not happening, with polarization coming back, a form of violence coming back, a very weak Daesh is probably not to deem it worthwhile to come out of darkness and try to devote the few resources that it has to kill innocent civilians. So I think the Daesh picture is probably going to remain what it is. If you notice, I'm not saying that it's non-existent. I'm not saying we should all relax. There is something, but that something is relatively small and under control. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jalal. I think one of the themes that we're seeing emerge from Dr. Sieb's presentation and also yours is the real impact and significance and risk of misinformation. And of course, this is something that we have seen extensive discussion on. And I think we will continue to, as you said, as the technology continues to improve and the skill of producing and budget, frankly, going into producing this type of content. So I think we'll pass the floor over to Noor to speak on the situation in Syria. The floor is yours, Noor.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be joining you. It's really lovely to be connecting with the community at AUC, which Arab Median Society was the venue for my first publication as a PhD student. So it's a very fond opportunity for me. So a little bit of a note here in that, as some of you may have heard, Dr. Krista Salamander was not able to join us. And so I've kind of prepared comments very briefly based on kind of finding out a little late, but I'm very happy to kind of see these commonalities between some of the themes that Professor Sieb has brought up, as well as Galal, in order to kind of begin to reflect on some common themes, common threads that are taking place, as well as some differences in terms of what is happening in Syria. Over the past decade or so, since the first spark of revolutionary fervor in Syria and the revolution and the ensuing conflict that has since become labeled the most mediatized conflict in history, the advent of several media technologies, media convergence, especially the increasing proficiency of lay people in producing media content, all have enabled a level of mediatized access across multiple platforms and media that have not been possible in the past. Yet, as the revolutionary possibility of the Arab Spring slowly shifted, and we went from discussing a very hopeful narrative of democratic transition to a more resigned narrative surrounding brutal government oppression, democratic sliding, counter-revolution, and even civil war, it's become ever more important that Syrians employ the media to validate, document, and valorize their struggle beyond the short spans of news cycles that have since moved on from the story of Syria to stories within and beyond the Arab world, from China, Ukraine, multiple climate disasters that have happened since. And so there's a cognizance of how the news cycle operates, very much so on the part of Syrians, and a consciousness of how they can utilize media technologies to their advantage in order to understand and navigate the shifting and short attention of the global eye. The very first mechanism that you start to see among Syrians using the media, and it brings up a foil, I think, to some of the themes that Zeeb was bringing up in relation to often the mediatization of conflict, but also this kind of media narratives warfare and strategic communication warfare that is taking place, is that there seems to be a fracturing of how Syria is treated from a media perspective. There is one narrative of media representation and, in fact, media attention that is very focused on a securitized view of a media landscape that is focused on different factions, fighting factions and their media arms, whether it's ISIS, different rebel groups, armed rebel groups, civilian groups, different government factions, as well as external players such as Hezbollah, Russian forces, a bunch of other external forces as well. So that is one arm of the media narrative that's often focused on looking at new, very much in the Al-Qaeda tradition, new declarations being made by some leader or another, new channels of information being created. But there's also, and I think, a form of resistance here in the other stream of media attention that is really driven by Syrians themselves, that's taking place on the ground, which is one that really focuses on humanizing the conflict. And I think for a lot of Syrians, they see this as the avenue to combat the short media attention span. So their sort of way of fighting against the moving on of the news cycle is to continuously valorize their humanity and reflect on the humanity of the struggle that they're going through in order to connect with audiences and grab their attention and compete with other events that may be taking place by simply not competing, by drawing on common universal themes that everyone might be going through in war and peacetime and in multiple different conflicts. One of the first realms of these contributions we saw was in the form of citizen journalism. Following the first outbreak of protests in Syria, ordinary citizen turned journalist friends of mine tell me how they transitioned from their previous professions. They dropped their ordinary everyday job, possibly out of revolutionary fervor, but also in many instances out of necessity because of the disruption of daily life. So they transitioned from these jobs into a self-assumed role of a citizen journalist, drawing from their need to respond and document what is happening on the ground, and publishing this on online platforms and in global mainstream media. When their efforts were met with deletion on platforms such as YouTube, for example, they pivoted to creating their own online newspapers. Of course, these are not necessarily newspapers per se, but finding other platforms to host their material, as well as acquiring affiliations with global news networks, wire services, and newspapers to formalize their distribution network. So this is one of the ways in which they try to capture and give voice to their own struggles and offer an on-the-ground view. And in many ways, it also was an effort to humanize their perspective, because their coverage as citizen journalists was very driven on the ground perspective of the ordinary Syrian, rather than a sort of securitized perspective of foreign journalists, oftentimes, who were very focused on what faction was where, and who was ceding territory to whom, or what battles were taking place. Later, we witnessed a new generation of Syrian filmmakers, and specifically documentary filmmakers, who offered us a realistic on-the-ground view of the lives of their countrymen, both within the country and in exile. Through their films, documentary filmmakers not only reflected on the impact of brutal government counter-revolutionary efforts, but also on universal themes. The Last Men of Aleppo portrayed not only the humanitarian work of the White Helmets, but also, even subtly in its name, alludes to the experience of masculinity and manhood in a time of war. It reflected on what it means to be a man, what it means within a very patriarchal setting to reinterpret manhood and the need to provide and the need to protect within the realm of a humanitarian effort to protect other citizens. Firas Fayyad's sequel to The Last Men of Aleppo came in the form of his 2019 documentary, The Cave, that followed Dr. Amani Balood, the first woman doctor to head a hospital in Syria. The film, through capturing the daily struggles of a highly accomplished and dedicated woman, navigating patriarchy while challenging it all at once, presented a poignant reflection on what womanhood and feminist aspirations in a revolutionary Syria were. It indeed showed the rise of women to such a position was in some ways made possible due to the extraordinary circumstances of the revolution and its aftermath. And yet it was realistic about the continuous uphill battles that women still face in that environment. It didn't shy away from showing how patriarchy worked within and outside revolution. And yet again, it provides these common universal themes that women are navigating everywhere, from the Supreme Court of the United States to the battlegrounds of Syria, in terms of navigating for their rights and fighting patriarchy. Then came, of course, For Sama by Wa'ad al-Kata'ib, that offered us a glimpse of the destruction, resilience, and new beginnings that accompany living in revolutionary times. We see her make decisions very dedicated towards the future of her daughter, about when to fight, when to resist, when to compromise, and when to leave, and why you leave. All of which are universal themes across revolutionary movements and social movements across the world. Decisions that, for example, Guo Binyang reflects on in China, relating to how social movements perhaps don't die, but how revolutionaries change their decisions as they become family makers. All of which to say that through its name, and in fact, in the names of many of these documentary films offer us glimpses into universal themes such as manhood, womanhood, motherhood, movement, home, all universal themes that reflect issues that are faced by communities around the world. And in doing so, they're trying to show us a glimpse of how people navigate them in the extraordinary circumstances that they're going through. All of which, again, is an effort to connect with global audiences, in which I would argue were, in terms of documentary film, very successful. In fact, these documentary films represent some of the first Oscar-nominated films coming out of Syria. They were highly commercially successful, but also provided truthful accounts of ordinary lives of Syrians in ways that many people very truly connected with, and there's a recognition to these films that perhaps hasn't happened for quite a lot of material coming out of the country. The interesting thing here as well is that a lot of the material coming out of Syrians identifies what I call the ordinary extraordinary of Syrian normal lives, in the sense that in capturing the daily life, they're capturing people who have become extraordinary in their ordinariness in a very difficult time in which they are living. And at the same time, they're able to draw attention to an extraordinary circumstance by drawing ordinary people around the world to the everyday struggles of the Syrian on the ground who's trying to live their lives. Throughout this conversation on mediatization and moving on from film to television, it's of course absolutely important to note the role of Syrian television drama. Syrian television drama predating the revolution, the musalsalat industry or the television serial industry was the primary avenue for discussions on social issues. It was one of the first regional exports of Syrian cultural industries. It was highly successful. And as you can imagine, as previously established industry, in the outbreak of protests, it was very well poised to navigate some of the discussions that were taking place. However, the musalsalat industry had to navigate quite a lot of different sort of tendencies within it, either revolutionary themes or counter-revolutionary themes as well. So we saw some shows that were critical of the outbreak of revolution, of the aspirations of the revolutionaries, and in fact had this victim-blaming tendency of asking them to kind of reflect on having known definitely how the government would have responded, and hence predestining everyone to the present that we currently have. So we saw some sort of navigating of this revolutionary and counter-revolutionary question, and we saw a lot of cultural producers have to navigate where they stood and what their values were in light of the art that they wished to produce. But on top of that, they also had to navigate government sort of pathways of distribution, of review, of censorship, in which they again found very creative avenues. So I wrote in the early 2010s about how Syrian producers bypassed censorship by Syrian government by going into regional and satellite markets. And here we saw them even go into streaming markets and streaming online platforms such as Netflix to again escape patterns of government pressure and to escape having to navigate the intersecting and competing interests of regional governments, such as, for example, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and whatnot, where they used to offer their material. So they chose to sort of bypass that in favor of something more international like Netflix. This is all to say that locally produced media has indeed offered us a unique and human-centered perspective on how the Syrian revolution, the government oppression of it, and the current unraveling of it into the situation we find ourselves in now. They provide iconic images, films, and shows that I'm sure will endure the test of time because they spoke to these universal themes and concerns that unify the human experience. And because they bypassed the in the momentness, this kind of media-centric and presentist perspective of trying to simply track what party and what group is gaining ground where and what battle is taking place, by focusing on the humanity and the more philosophical questions of identity that are plaguing Syrians, both in Syria and in exile, that they're trying to navigate in this media space, in this public space. And with that, I will cede the time to my panelists. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for that, Noor. I find that really interesting, the discussion about producing your own content as a way to sort of bypass the short attention span. And it's also, I think, a way to sort of reclaim the narrative, which there definitely is a real dignity to that, especially with some of the more graphic images that we've seen come out of the war and be circulated so much. One question I sort of have in my mind, and maybe we can come to this in the discussion, is what what cultural production, like you were discussing documentaries, which documentaries actually make it out of Syria and which documentaries get consumed by a large international audience and which don't, and also how Syrians see these cultural productions, as I'm sure there are differing opinions across the population. But maybe we can discuss that a little bit more later on. And I'll now pass the floor to Sahar Khamis to give us the feminist perspective of several of these contexts. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'll just start by saying I'm extremely happy to join this panel for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a nostalgic moment for me. I got my BA and MA from the Department of Mass Communication at the American University in Cairo, got a graduate diploma in television journalism from the Adham Center for Television Journalism at AUC. I was the editor-in-chief of The Caravan, the student newspaper at AUC, and taught at AUC actually for a number of years. And now, of course, I serve on the editorial board of Arab Media and Society, and I contribute to it. So there's a lot of reasons why I'm happy to be part of this, and also, of course, being with my longtime colleagues on the same panel, Professor Philip Seif and Dr. Noor Halabi. We've known each other for a long time and we've been good colleagues. And of course, seeing Dr. Amin and everyone else, that's really making me happy today. So with that, and don't count this introduction as part of my time, please, Sarah, okay? With that, I want to start my topic by saying that we have to deconstruct a number of important conceptualizations. So the first thing we need to understand is the plurality of women's lived realities and identities. And that's why I always steer away from using terms like quote unquote feminism in the absolute collective sense or activism in the singular sense. Whenever we talk about Arab women's lived realities and identities, it is always best to use the plural term. So we talk about activisms, gendered activisms, feminisms, right? Struggles, resistances, because there is no one size fits all that we can simply say, okay, so all of Arab women suffer from this and that. Let alone, of course, the comparison if you're trying to compare cross-culturally between the realities of women, let's say, for example, in the Middle East or the Arab world and the rest of the world, let's say, for example, Western feminism. I'm very careful about this point because some people try to take the quote unquote Western model of feminism as the end all be all, model or example that we should all try to measure ourselves against, which is extremely dangerous because it creates this kind of Eurocentric, ethnocentric type of mindset where women in every part of the world have to fit into the mold and the model of feminism as defined in the Western context. So that's why I want to bring up this point of staying away from the one size fits all and trying to understand and appreciate Arab women's lived realities, not just as they distinguish themselves from other parts of the world, especially Western feminism, but even within the same Arab region. If we're going to be talking about the realities of Egyptian women, it's different from the realities of Tunisian or Sudanese or Saudi women or Lebanese women for that matter. So we have to really create this kind of sensitive understanding of multiple gendered identities, struggles, and resistances. That's my first point. The second point I want to make is about the importance of also understanding the shifts in Arab women's activisms and resistances before, during, and after the Arab Spring. Somehow, some people think of Arab women and they think, yes, they had this great role in 2011. Of course they did. Youth and women were very much at the forefront of resistance movements, and they were very much at the forefront and the heart of activism in the Arab Spring movements. There is no question about it. But that's not to say that we should limit ourselves only to this, glorification of the Arab Spring moment, because myself and my co-editor in the last book, Arab Women's Activism and Sociopolitical Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, ourselves and other authors in this book were talking about the importance of understanding the different phases or stages that Arab women's activisms and feminisms evolved and developed through. For example, before the Arab Spring, there was more of a tokenistic form of feminism, where it's more like the first lady syndrome. The first lady will give certain, orders or, certain laws or create certain organizations, and that would mobilize women's movements. And then came the Arab Spring movement, and you saw this kind of shift from the top down to the bottom up grassroots form of activism, where it's not just simply the first lady putting laws or regulations, but it's more like ordinary, average, everyday women on the streets going out and rallying and asking for different political and social rights. And then, of course, we came to the moment of the post-Arab Spring, which we're going to talk about more with the derailment of the process of democratization in many parts of the Arab world, especially in the post-Arab Spring countries, ranging from military dictatorship to civil war to sectarian strife, to a lot of the other complicated, unfortunate realities, unfortunately, that impose themselves on the region and therefore limiting Arab women's activisms and resistances in so many different ways. My next point is trying to understand the concept of conflict, right? When we think of conflict, immediately you think about, oh, this is one country against another country, right? So it's a conflict between, for example, certain nation, Egypt and Israel in the past before the peace treaty, or different countries and so on. But there's also internal conflicts, right? Conflicts within the same country or the same society. It can be between the regimes and their opponents, the dissidents and the opponents of certain regimes. They can be between the regimes and journalists who want to get the word out. And they can be also between the activists who want to promote women's rights and those who are resisting the promotion or advancement of women's rights as well. This is also a form of conflict. So that's why we need to also problematize the term conflict and understand it as well in a much more nuanced way, especially when you talk about gendered activisms, resistances, and identities, that you understand this internal dynamics of these struggles as they play out, whether at the level of regimes versus opponents, or whether at the level of the advocates of women's rights versus the opponents of women's rights. That's why we need to talk about the dual struggle that Arab women are grappling with day in and day out. Yes, they do have, of course, a political struggle. They want to fight dictatorship and autocracy. They want to ask for more human rights, and they want to fight corruption and violations of human rights. Of course they do. And that's why they joined hands with men in the midst of the Arab Spring uprisings, putting their own lives at risk and being at the forefront and the front lines of resistance, risking harassment, imprisonment, or even being killed. But that's not their only struggle. Unlike their male counterparts, they have other struggles as well. They also have to fight the socioeconomic disparities, the gender divide on every level, the different levels of invisibility that they have to grapple with day in and day out, whether it is socioeconomic invisibility, not getting enough pay or equal pay, or in some cases getting no pay, as in the case of the informal, undocumented labor of women, for example, in rural areas. They work 12, 13 hours. If you ask them, are you working? She says, no, I'm just a housewife. It's invisible, undocumented, informal labor, which is very unfair for women. If they're working, sometimes they don't get the equal pay. And in many cases, they are the hardest to hire and the easiest to fire. And there are so many socially, stagnant traditions and unfortunately very negative patriarchal structures that still discriminate against women. That's what Denise Pandiati calls the double jeopardy for women, right? They have to fight the struggle politically, but they also have all of these socioeconomic struggles on top of that, creating all of these multiple layers of struggles that they have to really engage in and day out. All of these realities, unfortunately, became much worse for women in the midst of two particular moments I would like to highlight: the moment of the post-Arab Spring uprisings and the moment of post-COVID-19 pandemic. These two particular moments had extremely negative effects, particularly on Arab women and on Arab women activists in so many different ways. If you look at the Arab Spring or the post-Arab Spring, of course, landscape politically and also in a mediated way, mediated and political landscape, and they're both, of course, always closely interlinked and intertwined, you see the shift from the moment of democratic euphoria to the moment of democratic derailment. And in parallel, you also see the shift from techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism, right? So from the moment of like, yes, life is gonna be great, everything is gonna be wonderful, we're gonna see democracy, this region is gonna become like heaven, people are gonna have more rights, to a dim picture where you're seeing all of these derailments in democratization and a really grim picture in terms of the records of human rights abuses, number of imprisoned journalists and activists and human rights advocates, and the list can go on and on. Not to mention, of course, the civil war and also the very much difficult and horrible effects of these civil wars and sectarian strikes on some of the post-Arab Spring countries. When this happens, when you have this kind of grim picture, right, 10 years after the Arab Spring, and I will not say celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, because celebrating means you're talking about something positive and happy. And it's not a happy moment. I'll just say marking the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and I'll not use the word celebrating for all the reasons I mentioned now, because there is not much to celebrate, unfortunately. But marking the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring uprisings means that you also have to look at all of these derailments and what kind of effects they had on Arab societies at large, but then on women in particular, right? Because women suffered the most. So yes, there's this increase in human rights abuses and human rights violations, more imprisonment of journalists and activists, civil war and all of that. But how does that affect Arab women in particular? Arab women are struggling with what we can call three intertwined struggles. There is the political struggle to get more rights in terms of democracy and having a place at the table. And I always say, if women don't have a place at the table, they will be on the menu. And they've been on the menu for a very long time. So it's time for them to have a place at the table. But that's becoming increasingly difficult in our Arab region because of all the reasons we're just talking about now. And then you have the socioeconomic struggle, as I said before, to get equal rights in terms of the economic sphere and to get more acknowledgement and to get equal pay and not to be sacrificed and seen as, basically they can just go. They're going to have a male supporter to support them, which is, of course, not necessarily the case in many cases. And then you have, of course, they have the socioeconomic struggle, you have the political struggle, and you have the legal struggle. And the legal struggle oftentimes is a blind spot. People don't talk about it as if it does not exist. But it's a very, very important struggle that Arab women have to grapple with, of course, because you have bad laws that discriminate against women and really sideline them. The reason that you see, for example, the status of women in a country like Tunisia being better than the status of women in other countries, not just post-Arab Spring countries, but Arab countries in general. One of the reasons is the high literacy rate for women in Tunisia, but you also have the fact that women have been on the bench. So we talked about women being at the table. If women are also at the bench, they're on the bench, they're really becoming judges, they can make decisions, they can get rid of bad laws, and they can try to put in place good laws. We have seen, for example, the law against gender violence in Tunisia. It was an excellent, comprehensive law that did not just define violence as, domestic violence. This woman had an argument with her husband, he lost his temper and he hit her. So it's domestic violence. No, they took this to a much more broad and comprehensive level of defining the term gender violence. So they said, if a woman is denied a position or a job because of her gender, that's economic violence. If she is not allowed to run for office or she gets discriminated against because of her gender, that's political violence. If she is denied public space or she is not part of the public sphere, that is social violence. So they took the term violence and tried to define it in so many different ways. And that is one of the reasons why women's status in Tunisia is better compared to the rest of the Arab world at large, not just the post-Arab Spring countries. So we have to really be sensitive in terms of these intertwined struggles for Arab women, as well as the intertwined resistances that they also have to engage in as well in order to fight all of these barriers and all of these challenges. Now comes my favorite part, which is, of course, the cyber activism and cyber feminism part, which I've been writing about for a long time, since the beginning of the Arab Spring uprisings 10 years ago. So at the beginning of the uprisings, you had this techno euphoria moment, social media and new media is going to be the end all, be all. It's going to create some kind of, democratization, so much so that some activists like Wael Ghunim at the time said, just give people the internet and they're going to have democracy. Of course, fast forward 10 years later, we are seeing that this is definitely not the case. In the absence of active civil society organizations and active NGOs and other forms of institutions in these post-Arab Spring societies, the internet alone is not going to be a magical tool. It's not going to bring change all by itself. It's just not possible. So there was this over-crediting of social media and new media as the end all be all. You can even see it in the writings of many scholars, including myself, using terms like, the Egypt Facebook revolution or Tunisia's, Twitter uprising or Syria's YouTube uprising, right? So there were these kind of euphoric language. 10 years forward, we're seeing a completely different image. We're shifting from techno euphoria to digital authoritarianism. The regimes are becoming much more technologically savvy. They're building their own learning curve. They're becoming more clever. At the beginning of the uprisings in 2011, they were taken by surprise. They panicked. They did not know what to do. Some of them pulled down the kill switch completely. Countries were left in a complete, blackout in terms of internet connection and even cell phone connection. Fast forward 10 years later, they're much more technologically savvy and much more clever. And we are seeing the learning curve of these regimes really progressing and improving day after day. And also in parallel, of course, the learning curve for the activists, the opponents, and the journalists as well. So cyberfeminism then is a component of this bigger picture. At the beginning of the uprisings, Arab women were talking about, yes, the internet is so important for us. It's a window through which we can see the rest of the world and also be seen by the rest of the world simultaneously, of course. And that's more applicable to women in rural areas and marginalized communities, conservative, traditional communities, like, for example, some parts of Yemen, right? Or some parts of Libya. Conservative societies means that you cannot really, in many cases, go out in the street and protest. Or even you can only exercise your activism online anonymously without using the real name. But at least they had the window, they had the possibility of doing so, which became really important. So cyberfeminism was also hailed and seen as a great moment for Arab women. 10 years later, even the online space has its own dangers. So it's not only dangerous to have activism on the ground, the fact that you can go out and protest and get arrested or killed, which is becoming increasingly the case because of the dim realities and the grim realities in these countries. Even the online activism is becoming dangerous. Even cyber feminism is becoming more dangerous and more costly, with the regimes building the learning curve, becoming more clever and savvy in terms of using technology. You have the Syrian Electronic Army. It's an army of hackers that goes after the regime's opponents and hacks their own websites, uses their IP address to trace them. You have many different forms of regimes cracking down on opponents. Bahrain, of course, being a rich, Arab country, one of the Gulf countries, has the ability to, create also its own cyber armies to go after its own opponents online. So that means that even the online space, even cyber feminism, is not a safe space for women anymore. That's why some of them stopped their activism altogether. Others are only exercising their activism in exile from the diaspora, or some of them are simply doing the activism only under pseudonyms or nicknames or anonymously. And as I interview many of these women activists and journalists and so on, they all share this kind of disappointment. They're very disheartened by these difficult realities of either having to stop their activism or do it in diaspora. And of course, diaspora has its own potentials and limitations. Yes, you can be safe, so to speak, from the regime retaliation. They cannot really go after you. They can go after your family if they wish to do so. And in some cases they do. But in general, it's a safer space to exercise your own resistance and activism. But it's not ideal either, because in many cases, it does not create this kind of trickle-down effect to enough segments of society and does not create enough on-the-ground mobilization either. So it does have its own potentials and its own limitations, but sometimes it's the only safe way for some Arab women activists and journalists to exercise their own forms of activism or cyber feminism. Let me just add that also for women in particular, there is an added layer here. The regimes can go after their opponents and hack them and sabotage them and all of that. For women in particular, there's a sensitive aspect of really character assassination. In conservative traditional societies, if somebody goes after you through trolls and bots and all of that stuff, and they start to smear your name, destroy your reputation, you are the victim of online shaming and stigmatization. That becomes particularly detrimental and very dangerous and very negative for women, especially in conservative traditional societies. And unfortunately, some Arab women activists and journalists and opponents have been undergoing this type of online shaming and smearing and stigmatization online, which is particularly harmful for women in particular. So let me move to the last point of COVID-19. Definitely the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated and really increased a lot of these risks we were talking about earlier, right? So if you're talking about, for example, the political atmosphere, all right? A lot of governments now are coming up with what is called cybercrime laws. Cybercrime laws have been enacted in Egypt and other parts of the post-Arab Spring countries. And in many cases, these laws are vague and ambiguous on purpose. So they use terms like, oh, you can be accused of spreading misinformation or disinformation, right? And if you are caught spreading false information, you can really go to jail. In many cases, these terms like false information or misinformation or disinformation are vague on purpose, and some journalists, opponents, or dissidents can find themselves behind bars. They can pay the price of their own, sharing the truth, or if they want to just spread, information about, for example, how many cases of COVID-19 are there in this particular country or this particular community. They can find themselves behind bars, or they can be fired, or they can lose their own license. And we have seen that in some post-Arab Spring countries. So the political environment became even more hostile and more difficult for those who want to exercise activism. Not to mention the fact that the regimes also are using the mantle or the disguise of fighting COVID-19 to create new apps, new applications, and new, for example, strategies and techniques, like, for example, contact tracing apps or, surveillance apps. They'll say, oh, we're doing that to protect your health. We want to know how many people you dealt with today in order to protect your health. Okay, that's awesome. But these kinds of contact tracing apps and surveillance apps as well could very well be used to go after the regime's opponents and the activists and dissidents and journalists to also trace their own location. And in many cases, that puts them in danger and endangers their own life and their own safety. So to conclude, I think that this is a grim picture, unfortunately, for all of the reasons I mentioned. And when things become bad, they get worse for women. So when they're bad for society at large, they become particularly worse for women. And unfortunately, until this moment, there is still the mentality of let's fix all our problems first and take care of building democracy, and then we can pay attention to gender issues and women's issues later on. There isn't enough appreciation to women's issues. And I always say women are half of society and they give birth to the second half. How can you develop a society without having women at the table and being part of decision making? I'll just quickly say that after the initial success of the Egyptian revolution in 2011, women said, awesome. Egyptian women said, awesome. This is our golden moment. Let's organize Millionia, a million women's march, and go out to Tahrir Square and ask for gender rights and women's rights. What happened, unfortunately, was very disappointing. Only 500 women showed up. They were yelled at, they were called names, they were smeared, they were told, go to the hair salon, do your nails, go to the kitchen. We don't have time for this. We need to build our country. Of course, until you have a real shift in societal mindset, right? People have to acknowledge the importance and value of women's issues and the women's contributions to society. I'm afraid that many of these problems and challenges will continue to exist and perpetuate and grow. So you need to have the changes on all of these levels. Politically, we need to have more democracy and more freedom. Socioeconomically, you need to acknowledge women's rights and their own payment and contributions to society on every level. Socially, you need to be part of the decision making and part of the fabric of society and part of the public sphere. And legally, they need to be also judges and to create their own laws and to get rid of bad laws and create new ones. Until all of that happens, I'm afraid we're going to see a perpetual increase in many of the negative issues and challenges that have been impacting Arab women. So we hope that there will be some kind of organized, what we call coordinated Arab movements, not just within one country, but between different Arab countries, some kind of coordinated Arab women's movement that tries to cross the different ideological differences, engaging Islamists and seculars, those who are on the right, those who are on the left, those who have different ideological and political leanings, until we see this moment of some type of gendered, coordinated Arab resistance movements. I'm afraid we're going to see a perpetuation of many of these negative influences and challenges. And let me just conclude, and I promise you I'm going to conclude now by saying that you also have to shift from this moment of cyber euphoria we talked about before to a moment of cyber realism that tries to acknowledge both the pros and cons, the potentials and the limitations of cyber activism and cyber feminism. So when we talk about these issues of cyber activism and cyber feminism, we should stay away from the extreme of really over-crediting social media and new media, or the extreme of being cyber pessimistic and completely, not giving them any kind of deserved credit. We need to come to the middle ground of a realistic evaluation of the potentials and limitations, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of these digital tools, because at the end of the day, it is people themselves and it's women themselves who bring about the change when and if they decide to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Sahar. It's funny, when you were listing your euphoric language, I think you almost listed the title of your co-authored paper, which is in fact one of our papers with the highest citations, if not the one with the highest citations in the journal. It was your article from 2012 or 13. I don't recall exactly.
It was 2011. It is the one on cyber activism and the Egyptian revolution.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think now we can open the floor to Q&A. I've noticed our attendees, we have some media expert colleagues with us. So if anyone wants to ask a question, they can either put it in the chat box or raise their hand. and I'll give them the floor to ask a question or make a brief comment. While we're waiting for that to happen, I do want to just make a quick note because there was a little bit of a correction to something I said in my introduction by someone I'm very happy that is joining us today, is Anissa Mehdi, who's a journalist and a filmmaker who I actually interviewed for my master's thesis, and indeed her comment was part of the argument of my master's thesis, so I should be ashamed of myself. So she says, two major different elements from Jack Shaheen's time to today. One, as Sarah said, the vehicles for dissemination of information, and two, the people now engaged in disseminating information. There is an active growing number in the Western Hemisphere and Northern Europe with Arab heritage that are now professionals in the news media. We contribute to context in newsroom discussions, provide news sources, and speak languages relevant to the region on which we report. So thank you very much for that comment. Well taken. And thank you again for joining us today. So does anyone have a question or would like to make a comment? Just a moment. Go ahead. Full disclosure, this is actually my father. Go ahead, Dad.
Dr. Hussein, it's nice to see you and it's nice to see everybody. I really enjoyed the presentations. Absolutely important material and subject that is going on. The Arab region is facing serious problems, and the serious problems are connected with the climate change and fighting for resources and causing too much trouble. Professor Philip Saib, I think, was talking about the information, and the information is also could be a source of pollution, polluting the brains of the people who are receiving it. And this would cause a trouble. It will hinder decision-making and understanding where we are going in solving problems. So what I would like to see is trying to link the environmental problems with the conditions that the Arab world is going through. I think this would be quite important, two aspects to link them together, because we have the smallest amount of per capita water for the individual living in the region. We have the driest area in the world. So I think we have to try to figure out how we link the conditions in the Arab world with their environment. I think it's very important. This is just the points that I wanted to raise, and I would like to hear what anybody has any response to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that in addition to the political issues, of course, social and political issues that the region is facing, this is something that there's a reckoning coming, and there needs to be literacy and understanding of all of these issues, definitely.
Sarah, I think one thing related to that is I very much agree with your father. Hi, Dad. If about the importance of climate, because if there's one thing that it can be certain to be a cause for wars, if you can't get water, or if your crops are all failing. So we need to understand that. I'm a little fearful of that issue of about how it will be presented, because when you look at all the disinformation that's been out there about COVID, about vaccinations and that sort of thing, that creates a very challenging precedent in terms of how do you clean up the information universe and clean it up with objectivity, taking precedence over politicization, especially politicization when the information is wrong. I don't know who polices all this. This is one of the big problems we've had in the United States, for example, and throughout the world. And so once again, as long as we have this intellectual universe in which information flows so freely, which on its face seems like a good idea, and which so many people on the planet can access so easily, also which seems like a good idea, there are tremendous challenges that arise from that. And for those of us interested in information, it's really a brave or not so brave new world that we're moving into.
I think another element here of, sorry, did I interrupt anyone? Yeah, another element here of the interaction of climate change relates to, similar to what Professor Zeev is bringing up, this issue of climate change becoming yet one other layer of sort of issues we need to worry about in terms of disinformation, misinformation, and just the traveling sort of different narratives, and the fact that everyone can create content. And so it's not really climate change experts that are bringing things up. But another thing, and here I would point you to the work of Marwa Dawoodi's book on the Syrian conflict, which is excellent. And it really provides an extremely detailed study of the role climate change played in the Syrian conflict, specifically in that it finally sort of concludes the constant sort of reductionist narrative that you see in Western media about the Syrian conflict being caused by climate change, and it identifies climate change as one of the other struggles that Syrians need to battle for social justice towards, similar to every other society in the world, rather than the instigator of people wanting to go out and protest. So one of the things that we need to be clear about is, even when we talk about climate change, making sure that we recognize the agency of the people who went out into the streets and perhaps risked their lives, and having climate change be one of the things that they're actually kind of dealing with and grappling with, rather than it being the simple reason of why they decided to put their lives at risk. So I think I'll put Marwa Dawoodi's book in the chat. I make nothing off of this, by the way, but it is a decent treatment of that specific question if you're interested in it further.
Thank you for that resource. If there are no other points on that, Dr. Amin, would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes, I'm interested to raise some questions with regard to who's going to police all of this. In the presentations, which I admire so much, and I've been listening very carefully, you know, the information explosion was not really mentioned in detail and in depth, because what we have witnessed in the past decade also, you know, in addition to the explosion of the information with regard to different kinds of groups, as well as transnational media coming with their own agendas, you know, especially in the news and the public affairs programs, and the different kinds of groups who've been enabled to discuss their own agendas and try to attack other groups. So the question of policing is very valid. There is no regulations in the Arab world governing the media, as we all know. Anybody, that's why I always challenge, you know, people who are saying that, you know, people do not really express what they want to express. No, the majority of them, they express what they want in addition to attacking other people. So in this sense, when we talk about media and peace, I think that there is a lot to be done. Based on my own observation and in what's so-called the Arab revolutions or spring, I think that in addition to what happened with regard to the hundreds and sometimes the thousands of channels carrying information, whether this information is correct or not, there is always a question: what's the reference for the people? What's the source of what is defined as good news? Because also there was a lot of criticism of what's so-called public broadcasting, and also this criticism was directed to this kind of establishments as government voices, but still, in my view, they played a very important part because they've been trying to dismiss information to the public that is somehow is balanced, although contains a lot of protocol news. Adding to this, this incredible wave of violence in the media is not helping us at all to achieve any goals. And we have witnessed that, there is a lot of recognition to those who are really, the more violence they present in the media, the more popular they get. And there are so many things that research and only research can answer these questions, whether in the movie domain or in with regard to the new songs that encourage violence and the image of women and so the multiplicity of channels that is still in the process of growing is going to have multiple effects on the different kinds of populations, especially youngsters, and the culture is changing to a violent culture. And we also witnessed that in many countries. So the question of policing is a valid question, but is it going to happen with regard to what we have witnessed? I was, one of the people who, as an author of the Arab Satellite Charter, and I got a lot of criticism. That was before 2010. And this Arab Satellite Charter was no different than the Television Without Frontier or the Audiovisual Media Service Directive in Europe. But it failed. They stopped it. And now there is no control of whatever messages getting across to anybody and any population in the region. Add to that the different kinds of terrorist groups that use the media in the past 10 years. And we have been also doing a lot of research and presented papers in many conferences in Europe and the United States, of course. There was, of course, it contained somehow the number of channels that they've been used and the degree of violence and the kind of messages trying to recruit people to be terrorists, to convert them to be terrorists. But there are so many things like this still happening. So when you talk about media and peace, we need to have some sort of parameters of, a kind of reference so that we don't talk about, and measure with scales that are not really applied in this part of the world. We cannot really have the American, whatever charters that they have, or the European, and apply it here. This will be, something that is not going to have any effect on what we have in the Arab region. There are so many things that we can, discuss and try to research, but still the situation right now is not promising, and more research is needed. And I think this is a call that the only hope for me, although I'm very much in finding answer for who's going to police all of this, I'm raising that we need to have a huge wave of research that really address the different kinds of problems that we have with regard to media and peace in particular, and we see what we can have as a result of this researches. Thank you.
If I can quickly comment on that, this idea of policing then becomes a slippery slope. Like, I agree with Dr. Amin that there are so many dangers, right? And it becomes really more even dangerous when it becomes just an open realm of citizen journalism, and anybody can create their own blog or their own Facebook page or their own YouTube channel, and God knows what kind of content they're spreading. Could be misinformation, disinformation. He mentioned violence. There's also sexualization. There's also human trafficking. There's also, terrorist recruiting, which, you mentioned, Dr. Amin. But all of that, of course, is true. But at the same time, it raises the question of media regulation and internet regulation, which until this very moment is an unresolved dilemma. And the reason it's unresolved is because people are afraid of the term policing, and they think it's a slippery slope because it can open a back door for regimes in order to have a tighter grip and tighter control on the media with an iron fist policy that does not leave enough room for opposition or dissidents or views to be expressed, or give the regimes in this case more leeways in order to put in place more restrictive and suffocating laws like the cybercrime laws I mentioned, for example, just to give one example that could very well put people in danger if you spread this information or if you give this number or statistic that the government does not like because it contradicts the official governmental story or narrative about the number of infections or COVID-19 cases or deaths in the country. You can find yourself in trouble, or you can go to jail and you can be behind bars. In some countries, there is even restrictions on tweets. You can find yourself in prison because of a tweet that you actually shared on social media or some kind of Facebook post or some kind of blog post that the government did not like. So it's a very slippery slope, and it's really a chicken and egg question. You need to have a democratic society in place in order to be able to come up with some kind of enhanced and developed and nuanced forms of media regulation or internet regulation, if that's even possible. I don't know if it's possible, when you talk about the borderless nature and global nature of the internet. Or do you need to have some kind of informed citizenry and some kind of active civil society and some kind of grassroots a nuance and understanding and awareness to be able to create this kind of media environment which is really conducive for constructive change. So it reminds me of this chicken and egg question that we always talk about also in terms of the Arab Spring uprisings and democratization. Do you need to have an active civil society with NGOs and grassroots movement in place in order to have a good and healthy democracy? Or do you need to have a good and healthy democracy first in order to have enhanced and nuanced and active civil society? So all of these, I'm afraid, are very much unresolved dilemmas that we're still grappling with day in and day out. And if you just allow me very quickly, as I'm having the floor here, just mention a couple of points very quickly. One of them is when I talked about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I focused on the political effects and the political consequences in terms of more cybercrime laws and also the contact tracing applications and surveillance and all of that. There is also the socioeconomic aspect that had a very detrimental and negative effect on women in particular, as many of them lost their own jobs and their own positions and their own opportunities to earn a living, because in many cases they were just the organization or the company or the newspaper or the TV station would shut down or downsize. And who they get rid of first? The first to go are women, under the misperception that they are having a husband or a father to support them, which in many cases is not the case. In many cases, they are the breadwinners and the supporters for their own family, yet they suffered also socioeconomic hardship, especially doubled much more within the pandemic, not to mention the gender gaps in every single way, including the gender a digital divide, right? So the digital divide being the gap between technological haves and have-nots, those who have technological means and those who don't have it. But then you add another layer in the midst of COVID-19 when everybody is going online and everybody is using technology and everybody is depending on the internet. Women in many parts of the Arab world, unfortunately, do not have the same access, the same privilege of having 24/7 high-speed internet because of infrastructural, economic, and also digital literacy barriers, which means that the gender gap increased in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, including the gender digital divide, making things a lot worse for Arab women in particular in the midst of COVID-19 because of all of these challenges. And finally, I'll just add that the women I interviewed as well in the Arab world talked about three important functions that they were carrying out: education, documentation, and mobilization. Education meaning changing the societal mindset we talked about in terms of negative misperceptions of women, patriarchy, stagnant traditions, and also trying to play the role of, at the same time, besides education, there's documentation. So if something bad happens to a woman, she's harassed or beaten, she's going to put this on YouTube and make sure that the rest of the world is going to see it, and that her own harasser, whether it's a political harassment or social harassment or sexual harassment, is going to be seen by the rest of the world. And mobilization means networking and activism on the ground through organizing some kind of actual, networking or movement or demonstration and protest. Of course, needless to say, the first two functions of education and documentation, in many cases, they're still doing them, although at high risk to themselves, sometimes under pseudonyms or nicknames or anonymously, and sometimes from the diaspora. But of course, on the ground, mobilization is becoming extremely much more difficult and risky for the society as a whole, or people as a whole, but for women in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions actually, and a lot of people that want to speak. So I ask that if everyone can keep their questions and answers as quickly as possible. And that was not a direct, that wasn't directed at you, Sahar, just generally. Phil, did you have something you wanted to say? I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, I just, when I hear the term policing and government and information, it sends a shudder through me, because who do we want to do the policing? Donald Trump? God help us. Really, we have to police ourselves. And one of the things I found when I was researching information at war was the scarcity throughout most of the world in terms of teaching media literacy. There's really one country that stands out for doing it well, and that's Finland. Finland is the Finnish government. In fact, one official from the Finnish government said, our first line of defense is the kindergarten classroom. And critical thinking and media literacy are taught in Finland, beginning in kindergarten all the way through grade 12. It is fully integrated into the curriculum. If you're an adult and you're out of school, the classes are available for you as well. That, I think, is our hope. And there are some NGOs that are working on media literacy, but until we educate people, and this includes people at good universities like AUC and Harvard and elsewhere, until we educate people on how to deal with this flood of information, how to challenge, how to corroborate, and that sort of thing, I think we're in for a heck of a mess. And so that's something I would place on our agenda, is put a new emphasis on media literacy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a question from our colleague Adel Iskander, who's at Simon Fraser. Who, if you're in British Columbia, thank you for waking up so early to join us. So where is it? Okay. This is for Phil. Much of your examples about the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts articulate Israel's adversary as Hamas and reduces much of the Palestinian news and media narrative to Hamas. Where do non-Hamas Palestinian voices fit into this dichotomy? I think you're muted.
Where do what were you saying there? I couldn't catch it all.
Where do non-Hamas Palestinian voices fit into this dichotomy?
Oh, well, it's that was what I was offering there was just one example. And I think, I mean, the examples that I was citing were particular to Hamas IDF conflict, but that is certainly not the whole of the Palestinian picture, obviously. And one of the things that we're sort of talking around here is the highly competitive environment for information. And what we have so far, unfortunately, seen is those who can offer the loudest or the most outlandish information tend to get listened to. And again, it's the best way to combat that is through media literacy. I don't know enough about grassroots Palestinian communication to really get into this in any depth, but I think you have to recognize this competition is there. And the examples I gave, Hamas after the 2008-2009 war recognized that information competition is absolutely essential. You have to be able to compete in warfare and in many other areas. And in terms of other Palestinian venues or organizations, I think they have to compete on the world stage, and some, I'm sure, do it better than others. But that's part of media literacy too, is being trained to do that. So I think Palestinian educators need to think, okay, this is the world we're in. This is the world we're going to be in for at least another few generations. Let's figure out how to compete and teach the kids that. And because they're the ones who are going to have to deal with this.
We have a question for Jalal. I'm wondering how tribes in the Fezzan or the general south of Libya have used social media, if they have also jumped on the social media wagon and voiced their own view on things, or are they being overwhelmed by the East-West struggle? Jalal, you're muted.
I said it's a great question because it gives me the opportunity to speak about Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi, the son, the most famous son of Muammar Gaddafi. And what he has done this year has been really staging his media comeback. He's still nothing militarily. He's still nothing in terms of institutional support or territorial footprint. But the reason he has created such a sensation across Libya and even beyond, particularly in Africa, is because he has been a huge phenomenon on social media. And a lot of it is artificial and unorganic. I'm referring to the role of, let's say, Russian experts, but a lot of it is also very legitimate. And among this very legitimate natural support for Saif al-Islam is basically citizens of Libya that happen to live in the southwest of Libya, the Fezzan, which is exactly what the question is alluding to very correctly. No, you should not imagine those Libyans. They're not very numerous. We're talking about basically 500,000 out of a population of less than 7 million. But they're not overwhelmed. They have their own thinking. They have their own channels. They express themselves. They have a very specific opinion that is really attached to their own experience of how they went through 2011. They were very skeptical. It wasn't really a revolutionary province. They feel isolated. They feel very often neglected by both the East and the North when it comes to the northern, the East and the West when it comes to the northern elites. And a lot of it could be studied by just looking at what they say, what they discuss, how they post videos on social media. Of course, it's not completely free because there's particularly the efforts of Marshal Haftar to repress everything I have just described. Sometimes you will see a young leader post a video, and then the video will basically be removed because the person was physically attacked or abducted or somehow frightened into shutting up. But the question was a very smart one, and there's an entire life that could be tracked, could be followed on social media that is absolutely peculiar to the Fazan. And yes, they are tribal, but they're also in many regards very urban, very modern to some of them, especially the youth. So that would be a very interesting topic to dive into, really.
I'll give Anissa the floor. Anissa Mehdi.
Hi, thank you for giving me the floor. I appreciate it, Sarah. My comment was in commendation of your work and the work of the other people who are younger than I, who are on this panel and out there in the world, young Arab Americans, reporting from the mainstream news media. And I really saw that shift after September 11th. And I'm just thrilled, Sarah, that you included some of my comments in your master's thesis.
Thank you.
You made it so easy for me to stop being an active member of the news media that I've moved on to working in the nonprofit arena. And I run an organization called the Abraham Path Initiative, which basically takes reporters out of the cycle of information gathering and allows people and encourages people to find out for themselves by walking on trails that we've co-created in Sinai and in Palestine and in Jordan and now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq and in Turkey. So you can meet people and get to know who's out there, and that they don't hate our values and all of the wonderful things you have been as a panel expressing here today. My question is, what other ways can we as journalists and I as the head of a nonprofit be of service to expanding and advancing a greater knowledge of the human beings who are there, the cultures, instead of the politics, the arts, the agricultural practices that we need to be knowing about, because arid environments are a place where the Bedouin of Sinai have worked for a long time and fed themselves. We have a lot to learn from the traditional knowledge and the more modern knowledge of cultures in the region. How can nonprofits play a better role or a larger role in supporting a journalism that I believe that you're describing, which is to break stereotypes and advance our common humanity?
Was this directed at anyone in particular?
It's kind of directed at you, Sarah, but it's also Noor and anyone else who wants to take it up. It's a very open-ended question. I'm not coming at this with an answer in mind.
Okay.
Which is the way I usually was a reporter too. I didn't go in.
Okay. Noor, did you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think we can work collaboratively on this question, because I think it works with a lot of the different interests of many of the people on this panel, in the sense that we're all coming at this from different angles, right? So my perspective was very much about the importance of the human-centered perspective and the difficulty of covering Syria from that very conflict-ridden, very focused on the theme of death and the meaninglessness of it all element. But also there are elements within the field of journalism, and here I would point you to the work of Natasha Yazbek as well as others about ethically how journalists treat stringers and the way wires work, and elements such as how the global distribution within the journalism field works, and questions of journalistic ethics that are very pertinent to understanding how you can do better as journalists, but also how institutions that support journalists could be better performing that role. So like I'll just give one brief example. Recently, I was working with a friend of mine who is a citizen journalist in Syria, and we were doing a panel in New York on artists as witnesses to the conflict, and we featured some of his work. And we were exposed to all sorts of issues with newswires now owning permissions over his work. And so we couldn't even speak about the conditions in which he took these images, which were very poignant. There's an image he took of a girl. He was trying to do portraits of little children, happy portraits because it was Eid. And then right after he took the portrait, a few seconds later, a bomb went off and the happy portrait completely shifted and the scene shifted. And it was a very important moment for us to reflect on the conditions of the way in which that image was taken. And interestingly, we can't learn from a journalistic perspective from the experience of this journalist because he is part of a system of a global distribution network of permissions and other aspects that made the display of the image impossible for the purposes of our event. So I think it's important to have a conversation within the journalistic field about the boundaries of and the limitations of journalistic ethics in which the moments in which they're not serving their purpose, perhaps, or the moments in which they have kind of I wouldn't say gone wrong, but created abuses of power and imbalances of power, for example, in terms of stringers. So these are some of the questions that come up. And here I would point you again. I'm very good at unshamelessly plugging in the work of other people. There's some really good work there about the ethics of stringers specifically that I point you to, including the work of Natasha Yazbek. And with that, I'll wrap up some of my comments, but I feel like this is one of the questions that really speaks to a lot of the different themes that we heard from other panelists as well.
I'm really glad that you brought up those ethical concerns. I think it's such an important thing to talk about, and I'm glad that there seems to be a platform for that discussion, but there's still so much work that needs to be done in that respect. And I think another thing which also ties into what you were saying, Noor, is support and a platform for other types of stories that provide not just additional context, but a different narrative. There's been a lot, there has been increased amount of support for these types of more platforms, especially with all of the digital platforms that have popped up. There's definitely more space, but there could definitely be more work in terms of providing reach and there being more focus on providing alternative stories away from just the usual, as I said earlier, doom and gloom and the things that sell. I think as media professionals, I think I speak for many of us when I say that it's exhausting. You become exhausted with this constant, these constant negative stories, but I don't think we're alone. I think there is a general exhaustion and people are hungry for different types of stories. So more support for those types of narratives for sure. We are over time. We're having an excellent discussion. I really don't want to cut this off. I think if I'll just give space for one more question, because there are so many fabulous questions that haven't gotten attention. There's one from Aisha Parveen, which is for Professor Khamis. Professor Khamis said in her lecture, I understand that the problem is normative views about women that militate against the possibility of improving the interaction between media and women. I would like to request your reflection on the role of the mainstream media in either reinforcing or questioning such normative views of women.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is an excellent question. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I want to first address the previous question actually, because I think it very much relates to what Professor Sieb mentioned in terms of the importance of media literacy. I think it's very important to focus on really bringing some kind of attention to this important issue of media literacy, because what we are seeing in terms of insufficient or in some cases bad coverage in different types of media is because of lack of training, it's because of lack of professionalism. Let's face it, these are real challenges in the Arab media landscape. We talked about the political sphere a lot, because of course the theme of the panel being, about the Arab media between conflict and peace. But there are definitely other challenges as well we did not have time to address, like, the fact that there is still a need for better education, better training, better professionalism, in Arab media. And definitely, as Professor Sieb mentioned, this is a very important point, to have some kind of media literacy education on every level, starting from elementary school up to maybe graduate education and beyond. To address Aisha's question specifically about the role of mainstream media, unfortunately, as we know in the Arab world, that many of these media outlets are government controlled, right? So when they have the government control, either through direct ownership or through sponsorship or through appointing those who are heads of different media organizations or giving them funding or licensing, all of these types of mechanisms means that you're not having really some kind of free or, you know, there's no such thing as 100% free media anywhere in the world. Even in the most democratic or, you know, free Western countries, there are still some types of, codes of ethics or certain professional regulations or, you know, funding from, you know, different organizations or sometimes advertisements and all of that. So there's no such thing as 100% freedom, just like there's no such thing as 100% complete objectivity. We have to be very sensitive about these issues. But at least if you have some kind of semi-independent media, which is not totally entirely a mouthpiece of the regime, which is not completely a puppet of the regime, which is not completely policed and controlled by the regime, then you can have more hope of creating some kind of vibrant, active, constructive and useful type of media landscape that can help to change some of the underlying challenges we all talked about in terms of misrepresentation, misinformation, disinformation, falsehoods being spreading on the media, perpetuating violence, terrorism, and also for sure negative stereotypes and misrepresentations and destructive stereotypes about women and women's role in society. So let's think about it as that. The media are just part and parcel of a bigger picture. You need to address the educational system. You need to address family socialization. You need to address religious discourse. You need to address political discourse. You need to address civil and active society, having some kind of civic engagement and civic society which is active and vibrant. You need to address media literacy. You need to address media professionalism and better media training and education if you have any hope of, number one, improving media coverage in this part of the world, and number two, also providing a much more constructive and healthy environment for different groups, especially marginalized groups, including women, to be better represented and to have their own images, challenges, and their own issues being shown in a much better and much more realistic light. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sahar. Well, we are almost 10 minutes over time, so I think we should stop it there. But on behalf of the AMS team, the Adham Center team, and AUC, I would like to sincerely thank all of our panelists today and the audience, those who joined us. It's been a fabulous discussion and hopefully to many more. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely great. Thank you. And thank you so much for organizing the panel and putting it together. And thanks for all the fabulous panelists and audience and everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you all. Bye.
Hey, very good to see you. Sarah, you did a good job of putting this together and hurting the troops. Yes.
We'll treat her for coffee tomorrow.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hussein and I were dedicating ourselves to solving all the world's problems, and we got cut short by
long walks, huh?
Yeah.
From Cairo to Morocco.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good to see you, Phil, and good to see you, Dr. Hussein, and good to see you, Noor, and Sarah, and Farah. Good to see you all so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.